Thank you for joining me as we reflect on chapter 9 of Gentle and Lowly. And it's a chapter in which the author speaks about Jesus' role as an advocate. A funny thing has happened the longer I've gone on as a Christian, and that is you would expect me to feel more and more holy and righteous and get better and better at living a life of not sinning, but the opposite has felt true. As I've gone on as a Christian, the more years I've spent understanding who God is, the more I've seen my own sinfulness. In fact, the more aware I am of just how utterly sinful I am. In fact, that's not something that I alone go through. I think that's the experience for many, many Christians. The Apostle Paul begins by describing himself as the least of all the apostles. And then as time goes on and he writes more and he spends more time living as a follower of Jesus, then he describes himself as no longer just the least of all apostles, but then he says, I am the least of all the saints, of all the Christians. I'm the lowest of all Christians. And then finally, he later on describes himself as the worst of all sinners. The worst of all sinners. See, his awareness of his own sin increased the more he gazed upon Jesus. And I've felt that too. Sometimes it feels like, well, certainly I do sin, but I think I'm more and more aware of it. And sometimes it feels like I have nothing but fingers of accusation pointing at me. The devil would love to say that I have lost my salvation because of my sin. And it's in those moments that we need Christ to act as our advocate. Now, last week we saw how he constantly intercedes for us, that he is always there. He always lives to intercede for us and act as a go-between. He's like a bridge between us and the Father. But the role of advocate is a little bit different to that. There's different ways that the word advocate has been translated in the Bible. Sometimes it's described as a counselor or a helper, other times as a companion, but it's certainly one who speaks up for us. And in 1 John chapter 2 verse 1, John has been writing about how we should, well, the whole purpose of his book is that we would sin less, that we would stop sinning. He says that to sin for a Christian is to go against who we really are. But that's not where he leaves it. He says this in chapter 2 verse 1. But if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. We have an advocate, one who, on the occasion of us sinning, will speak up for us. That's what Jesus does. Now, we are very quick to speak up for ourselves. I make all kinds of excuses for why my sin isn't so bad or why I'm not to blame. I downplay my sin, or I try to ignore it and point the other way and compare myself to others. But when we have Jesus as our advocate, then the author tells us we don't need to do that anymore. Because Jesus doesn't downplay our sin or pretend it's not there or compare us to others. No, Jesus simply says that his blood has paid the price. That he has bought our salvation, that he has purchased us, that we are fully forgiven. And so when we sin, we have an advocate that doesn't make excuses, but rather one who is able to turn the anger and punishment we deserve away, to turn it away, and instead to bring us forgiveness. And so I'm going to finish by just reading a quote from this that tells us that very fact, but more than that, challenges us to think about what that means for us. If we have an advocate, what does that mean for us? And the author says this on page 93. What if we never needed to advocate for ourselves because another had undertaken to do so? What if that advocate knew exhaustively just how fallen we are, and yet at the same time was able to make a better defense for us than we ever could? No blame shifting or excuses the way our self-advocacies tend to operate, but perfectly just, pointing to his all-sufficient sacrifice and sufferings on the cross in our place. What if he did that? Well, we would be free of the need to defend ourselves, to bolster our sense of worth through self-contribution, to quietly parade before others our virtues in painful subconscious awareness of our real inferiorities and weaknesses. Instead, we can leave our case to be made by Christ, the only righteous one. We have an advocate. That's what Jesus is by his very nature, not just a role he takes on, but by his very nature. He identifies with us. He shows us solidarity with us, and therefore he loves us and defends us. Thank you for joining us this week, and I look forward to seeing you again next Wednesday as we look at chapter 10. Bye.